Hello, everyone. It's Andrew Ross. Welcome to the Great Canadian Aftermarket Podcast for this day. I don't usually state the date, but today is Tuesday, January 14th. And the reason that matters is that only a few days ago, on the Friday the 10th, the federal government announced that it would be pausing the Zero Emission Vehicle Incentive Program at the federal level, which was $5,000 for most battery electric vehicles and longer range plug-in hybrids, $2,500 for shorter range plug-in hybrids. And the way the announcement came out was that it would be paused as of no later than March 31st, but as soon as the money ran out, then it would be done. Honestly, within a day, consumers were already reporting that their dealers had tried to make an application and the portal had closed, the money was gone, and an update went up on the ministry's website saying, yeah, money's gone. So no more federal incentives for the not with that program anyway. So with me to talk about the impact of this change and other kind of related similar changes on the aftermarket is JF Champagne. JF is the president and CEO of AIA Canada. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Andrew.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously the most acute and immediate impacts for this are on the consumer and on the car dealer networks, which have kicked up a fuss. But from the aftermarket perspective, how should we be viewing these kinds of developments and the impacts that they might bring?
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew. First off, this is not a big surprise, definitely not for AIA Canada. We've been an active participant representing the auto care, the aftermarket, at the Zero Emission Vehicle Council. So the federal government has established a structure where we participate with many other stakeholders, departments of federal governments, provincial automakers, dealerships, and others about how to advance the adoptions of zero emission vehicle in Canada. And we've heard many of the challenges at that council, namely that infrastructures is not keeping up, supply, cost, and all these challenges were always tied into we got to have a policy support, meaning the government needs to provide those incentives and those subsidies to entice the consumer because there's still too much of a gap between traditional ICE vehicle and zero emission vehicle. And here we are. The government was always very clear. There's a certain amount of money, and once we're run out, we'll have to stop the program. So they gave us a bit of a heads up. And to your point, it created a huge rush of people just trying to jump in right at the last minute to qualify for the incentive. And by the way, the same thing occurred in Quebec, where just before the end of the year, what typically is a little quieter for the sale of new vehicle, you saw a huge influx of Quebecers going to buy an EV or a zero emission vehicle because, again, they're announcing the end of those subsidies. Now, what does that mean for the aftermarket? I think it's another clearer sign that while the government still has the mandate to go to 100% zero emission vehicle by 2035, there isn't a clear path we're going to get there. And so I think that it was always aspirational to get there by 2035. But the end of subsidies, the lack of deployment of infrastructure, it's just simply not keeping up. The charging infrastructure is not there. And quite frankly, the change of governments that we're going to see most likely at the federal level are all signs that we're going to continue to see more zero emission vehicle on the road. We're going to need to be prepared to service them. But certainly this is not something that we're going to see across Canada in all regions, in the next 10 years.
Yeah, because that's still, the depending on jurisdictions, kind of globally, either 2030 or 2035. The idea that all new vehicles would be mandated to be a zero emission vehicle of some sort. Although there's some any of the drafts I've seen have some kind of clauses in there that allow some flexibility on what that might actually mean. But nonetheless, regardless of what the alternative fuel is, the electric vehicles seems to be obviously the leading technology in all of these areas, and there's just not the I think certainly it seems increasingly there's just not the capacity of the governments, whether it's speaking to Canada federal or provincially, to maintain the funding for these programs at a level that would get us there. I mean, is that a fair comment?
Absolutely. In fact, on that topic, we're very much aligned with automakers dealership association. It says, um, you know, the sale of these vehicles needs to stand on its own, and the consumer needs to be making that choice because that's the type of vehicle they want to buy, because it matches their use case, it matches their lifestyle, where they live, what they do, as opposed to be a push by government through policies and mandates. And so we've been very much aligned. In fact, I encourage anyone to visit the website. Has been hosted by automakers and dealerships, the road to 2035.ca, which explains that if you want to get to zero emission vehicle, these are all the steps you need to have, and namely infrastructures, charging infrastructures is key. Now, what we're seeing a bit in the next little while is, I would say, the rebirth, but the alternative of hybrid vehicle becoming very attractive. So I think people are starting to consider the options of a zero emission vehicle. The battery electric might not have the right range, charging may be a problem at home, cost, and suddenly hybrid becomes a valid option. And what that means for the auto care sector is that while we're going to start to, I guess, service more and more various type of drivetrain in the vehicle, definitely a hybrid is going to be one of those components that maybe a couple of years ago, we're going to go straight to battery electric. No, I think there's going to be a good sizable percentage of the fleet within the next decade that are going to be a hybrid vehicle, which provide a bit of best of both worlds in terms of servicing and repair. So I think it's going to be again, another positive contributor to the aftermarket, because they both have the ICE and the battery electric drivetrain built into those vehicles.
Yeah, sure. I mean, at the early days, there were, and I still see some of it now, the big talk around, I guess, call it the threat to the service sector at all levels was the simplification of the drivetrain with an electric vehicle. And then you start looking at plug-in hybrids, and actually the complexity, increases over a standard ICE drivetrain system, which, I don't wish anybody to have a breakdown, but, common sense says the more stuff there is, the more stuff there is to go wrong, right? So,
Yeah, for sure, the complexity. I think the challenge for the auto care sector is not in the drivetrain. It's not how the vehicle move. It really is about the complexity of the technology going in all these vehicles, being ICE vehicle, hybrid, BEV, and maybe a bit of hydrogen down the road. And the capacity to access the onboard information diagnostic computers that are now necessary for even basic repair and maintenance is the real challenge for the auto care sector. It's not, being hybrid or battery electric. And as we always talk about, the fact that we don't have a right to repair legislation, there are no legislation still in Canada that compels an automakers to make that type of information available, makes it so that, as we're seeing now with newer models, regardless of drivetrain again, where even basic repairs and maintenance have to be directed back to dealership, is, I think, what the most concerning aspect of these changing technologies, as opposed to being electric or not.
certainly, yeah. Recently, my own personal experience, just as a way to say, it's not easy for anybody, because of a software update in a family vehicle, an update that was supposed to create an enhancement to the emergency vehicle alert system, is what they call it. But it created other issues that being as I live a couple of kilometers away from a hospital, I'm not sure if that it created issues with some battery drain and battery life, which then, of course, threw every code imaginable at it. And the branded dealer also had like a lot of difficulty understanding what was going on. And their specialist, who was, a couple of days before they could get a look at it, knew what it was. And this is something where there's actually an alert in the automaker's own system. Hey, look, this can happen. If it happens, here's what you do. And it still took 4 days. So,
Yeah.
the mind boggles if you don't have access to those systems and campaigns and bulletins. Um, you could be looking forever and chasing a problem eternally, and it seems deeply unfair to the consumer to have to do that. Now we're fortunate enough we have dealers, branded dealers in our community that were able to deal with it. It's a new vehicle, so it was warranty and all that kind of jazz, but it was even then it was not a simple fix to even understand what was going on.
Yeah.
So, from an aftermarket standpoint, as you say, all roads lead to right to repair,
Yeah.
and the need to have access to the information, and
Yeah.
it's tricky.
I often say it's the tale of two Canadas. If we go back again and think about how we are adapting in the aftermarket to the reality of more EVs and hybrid vehicles, you're going to see those in pockets. If you go to Montreal, if you go to Vancouver, in those markets, we are seeing the emergence of specialized shops servicing EVs and all the like, because you're already reaching a bit of that the critical mass. There's enough of those vehicles on the road that are getting to a certain age that we want to make sure we provide customized services for those. And I think they'll move into, I would say, B markets, not those primary markets, but eventually as we grow the park of these hybrids and EVs, we're going to see more of these specialized services. And remote areas, which are really not the right use case for battery electric vehicle, take a long time before we get there, if ever we get to a point where we really need to have active servicing. But what's the common point to all of these regions, regardless if you're urban or rural, is to exactly your point. How I'm going to be able to service and diagnose and repair a vehicle is directly linked to the information provided by a diagnostic scan tool. And where we've been able to reliably use aftermarket scan tools that are able to service all makes and model, there is now growing number of sets of circumstances where only an OEM diagnostic tool is really able to perform those type of diagnostic. And so back to your example, Andrew, is the real question is the aftermarket shop using a generic tool able to read the codes, interpret what the problems are, and be able to provide you with a solution? And that's the real question, is to whether or not we're going to be able to do that. And if at one point, shop is now having to invest very large amount of money to purchase literally a dozen type of tools that are essentially doing all the same thing, but they're all protected by software locks that forces you to buy all of these from each of those OEMs individually, which ultimately drives higher cost to consumers, reduced convenience, and forces you back to dealerships with limited choices for the repair. So that's the whole issue, I guess, ahead of us in terms of those more complex vehicles that are getting on the roads.
Yeah, and I guess, and it's a very good point. Again, reaching back into my own personal family experience with that vehicle and looking around at others. That same model vehicle is also available with a standard ICE engine, and a lot of the issues that some people are having with it are completely software based. And still having issues even with the dealers understanding and doing effective fixes on updates and all this kind of stuff. So again, the mind boggles the ability of an independent to service these vehicles shortly down the road when they're a few years old, if they don't have access to the same information, when those who do have access to the information presently still have a lot of difficulty in understanding what's going on. They're extremely complicated. The software is changing all the time with regular updates, and being able to stay on top of that as a professional service facility and individual as a technician is no easy task and made impossible if they don't have access to the information and the training
Yeah,
and the training.
yeah,
Again, even at that dealership that I was referring to, those who had not gone through the training and weren't their hybrid guy, as they referred to, they had no clue. They gave disastrous assessments of basically every system on the vehicle was now broken.
yes.
And it wasn't. It
It's
was just
yeah,
it's what happens to it and how it manifests when the
yeah,
12-volt battery is depleted. It throws every code.
yeah. The integrations of all these technology makes it so that the servicing cannot just be discrete to one piece of the system. It's got to be looking at the wholesome of all the components. But it wasn't that long ago that many in the aftermarket would do various type of repair directly on an engine. And if you think about today, not that many shops continues to do engine rebuilds. We've moved to much more of the larger components type of repairs. And uh, does it come a time where the vehicle as a whole is this replaceable piece of hardware simply because its intricacies and systems are too complex and it's too expensive to go in and change them all, which will be disastrous for the environment, disastrous for consumers, and disastrous for the aftermarket, quite frankly. But you've seen other industries, namely a cell phone. If you're old enough to remember the original type of cell phone, they were actually built, they were serviceable. Someone could actually take apart a cell phone, diagnose a problem, replace a component, and fix the cell phone itself. Nowadays, we've moved to the world of disposable cell phone where the whole thing is simply disposed of once it starts to throw you codes and problems and can be reflashed or no longer able to support the latest software that is deemed to be necessary for maintaining safety and all these statements made by manufacturers to say, we want to make sure we maintain the highest standard of safety, so your hardware is no longer capable of supporting that new software, hence you need new hardware. It's a bit self-serving, and it sure contributes a lot to carbon emission, the problem with throwing everything in a landfill, none of which can be reused because usually it's locked to software locks. So those are the debates that are going to be in front of us very much as we move in this next phase of the type of technologies put into vehicles.
Yeah, I guess from to my mind, in conversing about the most recent kind of news on the EV front. Of course, you mentioned Quebec. It paused its program because it had an oversubscribing, and there's some folks who believe that come the end of March when it's supposed to resume. I guess it's a February-March pause announced for Quebec on the incentives that because end of March becomes a new budget cycle, so there's a lot of assumptions that the program will just disappear. Even though they announced a kind of a phase out that would go beyond that. I don't I don't have that crystal ball. Certainly not en français, but
We all recognize that the incentive was to motivate consumers to buy a zero emission vehicle. We understand the stated goal of governments to accelerate that transition. But again, at one point, if you do the math, you simply can't sustain the type of subsidies that you need to put in. Never mind the fact that alongside these direct subsidies to consumer, the government has to massively invest in the charging infrastructure and the supply of electricity to make sure we could actually charge all these vehicles. And again, automakers have been very clear about tracking the deployment of charging infrastructures versus the number of new EV vehicles. And the government is not being able to follow through. So all these massive investments are simply not happening at the same pace. But we're going to continue to see more zero emission vehicle being sold year over year. So when you look at the curveball, not a curveball, but the curve of adoptions of EVs and zero emission vehicle, it clearly is on the right trajectory to become a substantial percentage of new car sales every year. And again, it's going to be regional, depending on the use cases and definitely play more into urban areas. But I keep saying, is 20% overall in Canada new car sales being zero emission vehicle within the next 5 years? I think we're on that track. Obviously it's going to slow down a bit, but it's still enough to say in the auto care sector, it's important to be prepared because if you start to lose 20% of your potential fleet of vehicle to service because you choose not to be prepared in terms of training, tools, and systems, you're going to miss out. And so we're seeing that movement, many people investing, again, in a market where there's more provenance of these vehicles. But will come a time where some organization will have to make some of those decisions. It's coming. It's not coming at the pace that the government was trying to get us to. We've been stating that very much clearly alongside automakers and dealerships. And these recent announcements just cement what has been industry positions in regards to adoptions of zero emission vehicle in Canada.
Yeah. Good words. So, from my standpoint here, just to kind of wrap things up, even though the federal government and potentially other provincial governments are lessening or pausing, their incentive programs, this is not the time to pause your EV efforts. On training and understanding what you take a look at your local market, make decisions based on what's on the road where you are, and talk to your customers. You may very well have customers who, even though they're not driving EVs now, regardless of whether there's an incentive, are really looking forward to having that in their, family fleet. And you should be ready to service those vehicles when they show up at your shop, right? So, again, thank you, JF. Thank you so much. And thank you for reminding us all that this all roads do lead to some kind of right to repair need. Whether or not the proportion of vehicles on the road is 100% EVs down the road or 20% or whatever it's going to be, the technology across the entire car park is increasingly complex and is going to really need for the aftermarket to be around and prospering to provide the service for the consumer, but also to have access to the information and the training and the tools to make that happen. Again, JF, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast today. Happy New Year to everyone. Still in January, and we'll be tracking this development as we move forward, and keeping you apprised of it. Thanks again for listening. Take care.
Thank you, Andrew.